Okay, so we are going to start. Uy. Thank you, everybody, for your patience. We are going to start. Thank you for those of you who arrived on time. And we already have people who are attending online, so we like to respect their time too. So, of course, welcome everyone, those who are here in the room at UPF. And thanks also to those who are watching this event online. The link of through the link that was provided. In case you want to share this link, it is available on the website of the Diverse Project. This is an event that we here at UPF have been really waiting with a lot of excitement. The Diverse Project, and you have met some of the people here, have been preparing this with illusion and love. But not only, we have been collaborating with a lot of people. The Department of Political and Social Sciences at UPF, through the fresh, new strategic program on equity, diversity, and inclusion that is supported by Maria del Maestro Unit of Excellence Fund, is starting with this event, actually. This is the first inaugural event that we have under this scheme. But people join this effort in organizing the event. We have to appreciate the support of the Center of Studies for Planetary Wellbeing at UPF, the support of the Institut Barcelona for Studies Internacionals, and also the C6 Geo3 BCN. No? We all participated in organizing this. It wouldn't be possible without the support of the lovely people in the team. I really have to appreciate Carol's support. Most of you have interacted with her here at the entrance. Clara, who prepared these wonderful posters and other events. Lev Jordan and Ines Cosme's support. This event within this program of equity, diversity, and inclusion couldn't have started better. So it was a bit serendipitous that Farhana Sultana was here in Barcelona because of this large, wonderful pollen conference that we had last week here. And we met in California a few months ago, and then when I knew that there would be the slightest possibility of her to stay a bit longer, I said, please, yes, visit us at UPF. I think Farhana doesn't need much introduction, but just in case, she is, of course, an internationally recognized interdisciplinary scholar on topics of climate justice, water governance, political ecology, development geography, and decolonizing knowledge. She is also a strong woman, and I could know this in these last few days. Her interest in feminist studies shows in the way how she relates with love and care to the topics and also to others that are around her. So I really, really appreciate that she is coming here to talk about her book on climate coloniality. But she's not alone. We have this dream team of people. Joan Martinez Alier, who most of us have collaborated with. He is a emeritus professor at the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology at Autonomous University of Barcelona. And of course, many of us know because of many achievements, but especially because he is the co-director of the EJ Atlas, the Global Atlas of Environmental Justice or Injustice. And we also have here, I'm very pleased for this, Marianne Manahan, who is a Filipina feminist scholar. I know her as an activist for many, many years. And then recently she decided to bring all this knowledge into the preparation of a Ph.D. From the University of Kent. And I'm very pleased that both Joanne and Marianne are going to bring her expertise and intellectual production, a commentary to engage from their perspective with the work of Farhana. So without further ado, I bring you Farhana Sultana.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Thank you so much, Beatrice, for that lovely introduction. And thank you, everyone, for being here today. And I want to especially thank all those who made my visit possible, not only to Barcelona, but to UPF and tomorrow to ICTA. So that's our very own Dan Brockington, who is in charge of pollen, he's a professor at ICTA. But then Beatrice at UPF and all her colleagues, and all the different institutions and organizations, but then also Morena, who's a postdoc at ICTA, who's making the organized, and Brototi Roy, who's here. So there's a lot of people to thank who have been involved in making sure that I'm here today with you, both in person, but then also online. So I want to just very quickly talk about the book, which is here. In person, live, actually, in case you thought it was a fictitious book. But it's small print, but it was thin, and it was a way to make sure the publisher didn't charge an enormous amount, and many of the chapters are open access, so if that helps at all. So the reason how this book came together was the genesis of this book, because when I coined the term climate coloniality, it expressed a way to understand the world in a way that made more sense to a lot of people in indigenous communities and communities across many places in the global south, of experiencing climate change and ecological devastation not as just a purely environmental or atmospheric event, but one where it was basically entirely wrapped up with histories of imperialism and colonization, international development. But at the same time, it was incredibly bound up also with issues around ongoing matrices of power. So formal colonization may have ended, but then the coloniality did not. So that shows up in racial capitalism, in the forms of governance, and so on. So I wrote a paper in 2022. It was a plenary lecture for the journal Political Geography. And that somehow went viral, and people loved it, and there was a lot of demand that we need to have this collective conversation. And that is the genesis of the book. So it was a collective project that brought many scholars and activists and students and young people together, and we tried to do something more than any of us could do alone. And hopefully that shows up in the book. And what one of the things is that we try to do is to showcase the different ways we can think about climate coloniality in lived experience, but at the same time, what it means to do things methodologically differently and to work collectively, while at the same time being very cognizant of the limitations of the work any academic does or any activist does, but how we bring more together as a collective rather than, so we're greater than the sum of our individual parts. The way that I thought about thinking through what climate coloniality means and how it functions, it shows up in the book itself. So the climate coloniality's three registers, as I theorized it, was that it occurs through material, epistemic, and political registers. So it has material consequences in terms of harm and ecological degradation, in terms of violent disasters and storms and so on, but at the same time, it's also epistemic because it's about words and discourses and policies and knowledge, whose knowledge gets to count in terms of how we think about the material impacts of whether it's sacrifice zones or extractivism or various frontiers of green growth. And at the same time, it's political. It's political because the governance structures through which we get to experience the violent dispossessions or the forms of green transition or forms of disaster management or forms of climate adaptation are very political, whether they're determined in the United Nations, UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, through COPs, the Conference of Parties, which is the climate conference, or whether it is through the erasure of different kinds of knowledges and then how it is then repackaged and it shows up in the violent ways we then experience ecological devastation. So why is it suddenly so hot in Europe? And it's kind of ironic to talk about climate coloniality at a time when you're experiencing these very, very extreme heat waves and deaths across Western and Southern Europe. So 2 weeks ago when I was in Amsterdam, it was the hottest day on record, and then I come to Barcelona, and then, yes, it's usually hot, but everyone's still complaining. It's a really dry heat, and it's prolonged, and it's relentless, and it's longer into the day. So we're seeing the ways that these things persist. So the material, political, and epistemic are together tied in trying to understand and better explain what we mean by confronting climate coloniality, what we mean by how do we go about thinking about dismantling this behemoth, to chip away, to reframe, to rethink, to think about different pluriversal possibilities. So the book is basically, this is just a table of contents, so you get a sense. So it's structured in 3 parts. So the first part is confronting and decolonizing climate governance. And there are 3 great chapters that actually look at about the legacies of climate development and governance and climate apartheid, but also in terms of what does it mean for indigenous actors inside the UNFCCC, or when we think about fossil imperialism and state power. And so 3 scholars bring these together. And it was intentionally designed in a way so that we have senior and junior emerging scholars, but also people who have very lived experiences or have been working with communities around the world. Then part 2 is confronting and decolonizing climate framings and policies. So this starts to get at the way we think about what are the epistemic framings, but then the policies. So one of the chapters looks at heaviness. So when I had argued in 2022 that climate coloniality feels heavy, it is experienced in a very heavy-weighted way, but we're constantly we're fracturing and fissuring through the cracks and emerging. So he theorizes the politics of heaviness as part of the climate emergency through historicity and sociality and also politically. But then we turned to 2 pieces of work that are looking at directly critiquing and changing policies. So one looks at colonial legacy of policies in East Africa, and the other looks at how wider African indigenous cosmologies are changing the way we even think about governance issues globally. And one of my favorite chapters comes from, at the time, he just defended recently, but a doctoral student, an indigenous scholar from Hawaii, and how he invokes his Awi perspective, his native perspective in critiquing blue carbon, in looking at how indigenous stewardship can fight ongoing climate coloniality to bring a much more sort of resurgence politics, but also one of refusal. Then the third and last part is called Confronting and Decolonizing Climate Responses and Praxis, and this looks at much more in terms of the grounded, the activists, the local resistance movements, social movements, but also those that are rejecting and pushing back certain narratives. So whether it is about performative environmentalism in India, or looking at Elon Musk's SpaceX in Boca Chica, national park, which is in Texas along the Mexican border, and how people are fighting both class or caste privilege, and also looking at the whole colonial discourse of terra nullius. And then we turn to coming back to the heart of former empire, the UK, to look at anti-blackness in Hull, in flood response. And that was, again, by a young doctoral student looking at the ways, how have we theorized, how have other scholars theorized disaster response. And then the last chapter brings us to Puerto Rico and in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, and looking at the ways that energy transformations are wrapped up with these forms of climate coloniality, and also very much anti-poor policies, and this form of a kind of Northern Europe and also Northern North America, and the forms of ways of green transition are debated and enacted. Then the afterword comes from Mimi Schuller, who's perhaps the most senior because she's the Dean of School of Global Studies at Worcester Polytechnic Institution. She does a brilliant summary of looking at the ways of these come together in terms of thinking about climate mobility, but also at the same time of looking back to look forward and thinking of these across scales, and thinking about the ways the chapters not only come together, but then they also push the boundaries of how we think about other issues. So when the book ultimately as a project is trying to look at the ways we can enact a different form of pluriversal future, a different way of thinking of our collective pathways in both epistemic, political, and material registers, but at the same time, thinking through and thinking together. So how do we change methodology? How do we address different epistemological boundaries? How can we think of different policies in terms of the way we can even imagine what is the other world we want, and who is invited to these visions, whose voice is counting? Or, in a way, how can we think about listening to our own reflexive voices, practice deep listening, and relational privilege in elevating people if we have the different types of privilege, and we usually do, because we are sitting in a university, we are talking in lingua franca, we are in English, we are in an air-conditioned room, so those are axes of privilege, yes? So how do we then think about working in collectives jointly across borders, across spaces, across groupings? So there's a lot about this in the book, but also in the wider collective work in political ecology that is looking to push the frontiers of our knowledge. And then finally, I'll conclude with just the fact that if you would like to know more about the book, there are several open access chapters. Most of it you can just access straight from my website. It's literally my name, farhanasultana.com. And in conclusion, what I want to just sort of leave you with is the fact that there are, obviously the endorsements, our very own Joan Martinez-Alier was one of them, along with Vandana Shiva, Naomi Klein, Amityav Ghosh, Sabelo, Ndevu Gatsheni, and Gurminder Babra. But in the sense that it was meaningful to me, but Joan made the comment about this kind of optimism. And I think it's really important in a time of great desperation. How do we still remain optimistic that we can build another future, that another world is coming, and as Arundhati Roy said, that we can hear her breathing as she's coming, but we just need to figure out a way to invite her in and be with her. So there's a passage in the book that I just want to, just two sentences that I will just read out, because the book starts with two different realities of children drowning versus children walking deserts to find water. So between these two worlds is the other world that we must enact, because that is not the world we want. So I ended by basically saying that there's this heaviness that we feel, but at the same time, we exist, right? So we speak in our native tongue, we sing, dance, pray, rejoice, create, celebrate. We protest, resist, persist, and honor and remember. We are one and we are many. And of the many in the past, present, and future, we seep into soil and stone, soar into skies, flow with waters. We are fragments and collectives, accomplices and kin across time and space. We learn and teach, we share when we do, we listen and raise our voices. So giving up is not an option because it never was. This heaviness cannot last forever. While I still have many questions with no clear answers, and I worry about these things all the time, but there is no conclusion, and this is endless work. Lorai Cholbe, which is the struggle continues. So I will leave you with that. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Farhana. I'm really moved, touched, as probably everybody here. When we were thinking of how to organize this event, for Farhana it was really important that Joan would be here, and Joan would bring some of his expertise, having in mind that he has already, as you mentioned, known well about the book. So we thought that it would be nice, that would be a couple of commentaries from the informed perspective of you two. So at this stage, I would invite you and also Marianne for doing so. Perhaps let's start with Marianne. You can yes, you can leave
I'm
from
afraid
there.
that I'm a very short person, so I'm afraid that if I stand at the podium, you won't be able to see me. So if you indulge me, I'll just sit in my table here beside Joan. Thank you very much to the organizers, and especially Bea, for inviting me to join this conversation alongside the indefatigable Joan Martinez-Allier, and to reflect on the latest book of our scholar, activist powerhouse, Farhana Sultana. It's such a privilege and honor to be here with all of you. I want to begin with a scene from Bukidnon, which is a province located in Mindanao region in southern Philippines. This story from my research field site has stayed with me for years. It is early morning, the fog still clinging to the shoulders of the multiple peaks of Mount Kitanglad Range. I'm sitting with Bai in Atlawan and several community elders outside the ritual house. They were preparing a ceremony, an invocation for guidance from their spirit kin before entering the forest to check on areas threatened by poaching. As they mix the betel nut and lay out the ritual materials on the table, the conversation drifts to the changes in the mountain, the thinning of certain tree species, the shifting behavior of birds, the new pressures from conservation zoning and encroaching extractive interests. At one point, Bai turns to me and says, "The mountain is speaking differently now. Climate change is not only about the weather. It is about relationships that have been disturbed." That sentence, simple, grounded, and profoundly political, captures the horizon from which I want to read Farhana Sultana's edited volume, Confronting Climate Coloniality, Decolonizing Pathways for Climate Justice. Because the book, as she has told us in the beginning, asks us to confront precisely this. Climate change is not only about a crisis of the weather or atmosphere of carbon. It is a crisis of relationships, of power, of world making. In my intervention, I want to share 3 reflection points to mirror a bit the book's outline. First, the book's central provocations and central contribution that stood out to me and stayed with me. Second, I will read it alongside other critical intervention, including our own co-produced volume, The Geopolitics of Green Colonialism, Global Justice and Eco-Social Transitions, to situate it within a broader genealogy of Global South thinking and activism for climate and environmental justice. And finally, I will reflect on what this book asks of us politically. Throughout these 3 reflections, I will draw on my own research and activist engagements in the Philippines and generally in Southeast Asia. So for my first reflection, the book for me, Farhana's edited volume, really emphasizes climate coloniality as an enduring structure and not a metaphor. The book is not just another contribution to climate justice scholarship, it shifts the terrain of the debate. It asks us to consider a deeper proposition. What if the climate crisis itself is structured by coloniality? And if this is true, and if you've read the book really makes a compelling and convincing case, then climate justice cannot be just about reduction of emission targets, techno fixes, and more inclusive climate governance, which is a very in thing now to kind of include all voices, particularly from marginalized communities. So the book really asks us that we must begin by dismantling what Anibal Quijano calls the coloniality of power, the enduring relations of domination that organize global climate governance today. The book defines climate coloniality not only as a historical residue, but as an ongoing system reproduced through neoliberalism, racial capitalism, fossil extraction, conservation regime, finance, and international development. And I think the book is really emphatic in claiming that the climate crisis is neither accidental, neither natural, nor universal. Rather, it is produced through colonial capitalist accumulation and reproduces unequal vulnerabilities. So this framing for me really unsettles a lot of the dominant climate narratives that we've been hearing for many decades for now. And using this framing, we can see that carbon becomes only one part of the story because empire, race, debt, militarism, extractivism, and epistemic authority becomes equally central analytical categories. For those of us working in Southeast Asia, these dynamics are really painfully familiar. The Philippines is simultaneously, for example, framed as a climate victim on one hand, and on another, a frontier of green extraction, where nickel for electric vehicle batteries are extracted, carbon forest, offset forest entering indigenous territory, and renewable energy corridors reshaping rural landscapes. These projects reproduce the same logics of dispossession that created the climate crisis in the first place. And as the book has brilliantly foregrounded, they generate multiple layers or forms of violence. So communities, for example, across Southeast Asia encounter slow violence in the form of polluted rivers, eroded food systems, and the gradual enclosure of land through conservation zoning and renewable energy projects. These are paired, for instance, with bureaucratic and epistemic violence, where technical assessments, carbon accounting protocols, and environmental impact statements override indigenous territorial claims or redefine customary practices as quote-unquote illegal. And when communities resist, whether against nickel mining in Palawan, or geothermal expansion in the North Sulawesi in Indonesia, or even forest carbon projects in northern Thailand, these slow and epistemic harms frequently escalate into direct violence, which includes surveillance, criminalization, and killings of land defenders. So for example, in the last 10 years, the Philippines has remained among the world's most dangerous places and countries for environmental defenders. Surfacing these forms of violence is crucial because they structure how green transitions and are lived on the ground, and they reveal the political stakes of climate and environmental governance, who bears the risks, who absorbs the harms, and whose worlds are sacrificed and made precarious in the name of planetary repair, which is so much at the center of the book of Farhana and the editors. But I think for me, the most powerful intervention of the book is its insistence that climate coloniality is deeply epistemic. It challenges Eurocentric monopolies over environmental knowledge. And I think the third part, which Farhana mentioned a while ago, really foregrounds and treats indigenous governance, Black ecological traditions, ecofeminist practice, and everyday practices of care, and emotional political ecology that Farhana brilliantly pioneered a couple of decades ago as legitimate sites of climate thought. So here I think the book really brings the point home that communities that are typically cast as victims or basically stewards to be employed in conservation and market-based, nature-based solutions are actually producers and theorists of climate change and climate justice. My second reflection is I think the book should be read alongside decades of global South scholarship and activism that have long challenged the universalist assumptions of mainstream environmentalism. And I think we've discussed this in the morning, that a lot of your the shoulders that you really build on and stand on are feminist scholars, and and it's the same for me. They are like my mentors and and ancestors in this academic journey that I'm doing. So, for instance, for me, the book really enters into Joanne's environmentalism of the poor, which shows for a long time that ecological conflicts are fundamentally distributive struggles over land, water, forests, and livelihoods. But I think Farhana's volume extend that insight into the climate crisis, asking why this conflict remains so unevenly dispersed and why climate governance often reproduces rather than resolves them. It also resonates deeply with our collective book, The Geopolitics of Green Colonialism, that I co-edited with Miriam Lang and Breno Bringel. Our volume maps the emerging architecture of green capitalism from lithium and nickel mining to carbon markets and hydrogen corridors under what Marisdelas Vampa and Breno call as the decarbonization consensus. So it shows how certain bodies, landscapes, and whole populations are rendered disposable and invisible. Christos calls this as green sacrifice zones. This is how I think the mutual constitutiveness of colonialism and capitalism that have existed since the 15th century are reenacted today. Geographies destined for accumulation prey on other geographies destined to be plundered. While today's green colonialism is exactly as materially expropriating as other colonial relations before, I think it complicates resistances by proclaiming itself environmentally friendly and indispensable in order to grant humanity a future. A journey where the racialized populations of the global north and the global south apparently still have no seat. And I think, indeed, Farhana's collection, brilliant collection, provides the conceptual grammar and analytical handles for understanding these developments as expressions of climate coloniality. I'll move into my last and third and final reflection, and I really want to take up the book's central political call and challenge of decolonizing climate coloniality. In the book, Farhana stressed that it's not about diversifying climate governance or just adding indigenous voices to existing systems. It requires a profound political, material, discursive, and epistemic epistemological transformation of how humanity should relate to the earth. Building on this and drawing from my research with indigenous communities in the Bukidnon, Talaandig, and Higaonon territories in southern Philippines, I want to highlight the 4 dimensions of what it means to decolonize the climate from their indigenous lens and worlds. So first, politically, that is recognizing indigenous self-determination and land rights as foundational to climate justice. Second, materially, confronting the unequal distribution of environmental burdens and in supporting indigenous stewardship of territories that have sustained biodiversity for generations. Discursively, that means moving beyond narratives that either cast indigenous peoples as vulnerable and victims of the climate crisis, or as culprits of degradation, or as guardians to be mobilized for state and market conservation. And finally, epistemologically, valuing indigenous ways of knowing, being, and acting as equally legitimate systems of understanding climate change, resilience, and reciprocity. But as Farhana mentioned a while ago, this engagement must resist romanticizing and patronizing indigenous peoples. Indigenous communities, as the book mentioned, are not timeless guardians of nature. They're not frozen in the past and untouched by modernity. Rather, and my indigenous interlocutors have emphasized this to me, they are dynamic political actors negotiating change while asserting self-determination. So recognizing this complexity is essential to build genuine solidarity rather than reproduce certain colonial stereotypes about indigenous peoples. So ultimately, for me, a decolonized climate present and future is one rooted in relationality, which feminist scholars have been putting out, like Farhana, for a long time now. And now I'm so amazed at how relationality is at the core of the debates last week. I mean, I couldn't imagine this like 20, 30 years ago, but now it has become a very in thing and a buzzword. But for indigenous peoples, that means the recognition that climate solutions cannot emerge from systems of domination, extraction, and separation. So for me, the lessons from indigenous communities that I want to bring here into this space is that they demonstrate that sustainability is not an empty signifier. It is not a technical metric. It is about lived practice of mutual responsibility and care. In closing, let me return again to Bukidnon, to another moment with Bae in Atlawan. We were walking along a ridge overlooking the forest, discussing the pressures of their territory, from logging, water grabbing, into protected area bureaucracy. At one point, she said, if something is broken and you want to fix it, you have to repair relationships. She was not speaking metaphorically, but politically. She meant repairing the dense, lived networks and ecosystems of indigenous life, relationships to the land, to the forests and mountains, to governance system grounded in consent and kinship, to responsibilities carried across generation and to more than human relatives. So in Bae in Atlawan's worlds and worldviews, repairing relationships means restoring the political worlds that colonialism tried to sever. It is to rebuild the conditions under which indigenous nations and communities can enact climate justice on their own terms. And I think we can all learn from that horizon, because confronting climate coloniality ultimately asks us to repair relationships between people and land, between past, present, and future, between justice and the more than human world. Thank you very much for listening.
So we move now to Joan Martinez-Alia's participation.
Okay, thank you. I wrote this short endorsement for the book, I don't know when it was, about 1 year ago, 1.5. And of course I read the book before, but an endorsement for a book is always like a formal kind of thing. You have to praise it, of course. But I really, what I wrote about be optimistic, do not fall into despondency. Despondency is not a word that I use normally, and I'm not sure exactly what it means, but it means a mixture of skepticism and tiredness, no? And I feel it in some of my postdocs, actually. They are quite young and they are already tired. And because of the wars around the world and the Ukrainian war, Palestine, and so on. So in this book, your book is not despondent. It's an optimistic book because it shows, whereas you yourself, and you also, that you can be born in the South and a woman, and then do, I don't know how much you have been fighting all your lives to reach independent status and to be able to speak to the world from the South, not just from the North. And to speak on materiality, on the politics and the epistemology, as you have shown. So I'll stick to this materiality, politics and epistemics triangle that you probably wrote this after having the chapters and you thinking about what you had done for the book. So talking about the origins of climate change in the sense of the episteme or the scientific origins, well, as many will know, there are several people who one could claim were the first ones, but one clearly, the first ones was Arrhenius from Sweden in 1886. He wrote an article in a major academic journal saying, I read this long time ago, the article, which was also published in German at the time, in textbooks of world cosmology. This was the title they gave to global ecology at the time. And it says that if we go on burning coal at the present rate of 86, and we double the content of CO2 in the atmosphere, the temperature will rise between 2 and 3 degrees. And he went on, if we triple the content, which of course would be, at the time he was writing, it was 300 parts per million. Now we are only 430 parts per million, growing up 2 parts per million every year. So if we triple from 300 would be 900, then the temperature would raise 8, 10 degrees and so on. So this was known, and it was known by all ecologists and physicists, and it was not disputable. And nevertheless, it has been disputed, isn't it? And also, much later, I learned about this, about 100 years after, because I was an economist. Nobody had taught me about this in my travels in several universities, or I didn't pay attention, probably I should have. But 100 years later, when I was already in my late 40s, 50s, I was in Stockholm, and Anne-Marie Jansson, an ecologist, one of the founders of ecological economics with Herman Daly and Bob Costanza and myself in the late 80s, he showed to me the statue in the university of Arrhenius, because he was a Nobel Prize in chemistry for work on catalysis, not work on climate change. And he said, this is Svante Arrhenius. Do you know who he was? And he said, well, when somebody asked, you say, oh, you mumble something to try to dissimulate your ignorance. And then she explained better who he was and the relation to what we were doing, which was founding the Society of Ecological Economics. This was, let's say, 85, 86. And the killing curve was already, had been started to be measured in Hawaii, because it was a quiet place in a mountain. Sometimes there are eruptions, actually. It's not so quiet. But in Mauna Loa, and we know this curve which is going up. This for you must have been already been taught for the younger ones in your secondary school, I hope. But if not, we all here in the room, we know about the killing curve. So this comes really from, well, comes from the north in two senses. The coal being burned and producing excessive amounts of carbon dioxide could not be absorbed by the forests and the oceans, and was already accumulated in the atmosphere, came from the north, did not come from Bangladesh, or a little bit from Kolkata, perhaps from the coal in the colonial ships but we know this. It was from the north, and has been from the north. It is still from the rich people in the world who are producing too much, or we are producing too much carbon dioxide. But also the science of it was from the north, and could be dissimulated and not talked about very much. It was very political, really. It was not pure science. It was a very political science, saying stop burning coal and oil. Isn't it more than this? What can you do? Change the economic system. But this was the implication. But there was no reaction to this until much later, the late 80s, the 90s, and in the 80s it was Bert Bolin. I also knew him because it was another Sweden. I think there was some tradition from Arrhenius, who was the first head of the IPCC. And so the IPCC met in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro, or before, in Villach in Austria, and then in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro with an international treaty, and this when the issue, the political issue of climate change exploded. Before that, in Delhi, Anila Garbal and Sunita Narain, who was a young girl at the time, or in her 20s, and Anila Garbal was an engineer, had founded the Center for Science and Environment on their own as journalists from the South. Nobody was helping them. And they founded this, which is still going on, the Center for Science and Environment, and they published a pamphlet against some calculations that the World Resources Institute in Washington had done. The World Resources Institute said, of course, the fault, the responsibility, the debt, we didn't say the word debt or liability, but the objective responsibility comes from the rich people in the world burning some excessive amount of fossil fuels, the responsibility for the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But the World Resources Institute, which is nearby the White House, actually was a think tank, but very close to the US government, said, but also these poor countries like Laos, they said, for instance, who are burning a lot of wood, a lot of forests, no? Not for cooking, forests. They are burning forests in Sweden cultivation. Every year, it grows again, isn't it, with Sweden cultivation? They didn't say this. They said they are burning a lot, and therefore they are also contributing per capita. Taking small countries or countries with few population and burning a little of wood for your own Sweden cultivation, of course, meant a lot of carbon dioxide. And Anila Garbal and Sunita Narain got very angry with this, actually, and published this pamphlet, which is called Global Warming, a Case of Environmental Colonialism. This is, obviously must have been the first time that the word colonialist was applied to the political study of climate change. And it was not an academic study simply, it was a lot of figures, became very well known, at least among the leftist ecologists in the world. I don't know whether they went to Rio de Janeiro or not, but it became, even this was before internet, 1990 still, and became very well known, and it blamed the rich people in the world, the colonialists of the world. They didn't say colonialists, they didn't say imperialists, they could have said for climate change, which was happening and would happen more. So this is something that we know, and I put it here because, well, I think that's the topic of today, confronting climate coloniality, and I would like to know your views about this South Asian origin of the, not that in the politics of India this had much influence, but it had some influence. So Jyoti Parikh, for instance, published some academic articles after 92, 93 on the ecological debt, already saying. All this could be translated, if we have to diminish emissions, who is going to diminish the emissions? Well, this will diminish the emission will mean an economic cost, because if we assume that for each kilogram of carbon dioxide we diminish a proportional part of the GDP, these kind of calculations, and it is the rich that diminish, then this will be some money. If they do not diminish anything, which is the case, they did not really diminish until much later, some of the countries, this is accumulating an ecological debt. She was an economist, or she is still an economist, and therefore she put it in money terms. I had some calculations that I remember in my textbooks at the time already, with Sir Ramos Martin from here, we all the time were putting these numbers coming from Jyoti Parikh in India. Other people then already introduced this term of ecological debt, which I would like also your comments on this, which are already probably available in several places. Because ecological debt, not because people read the pamphlet from Delhi perhaps, but because it was on the reality actually. We don't have to be very sort of financially minded to realize that if some people in the world are changing the climate or are making a hole in the ozone layer, which was the other thing at the time, which was solved technically more or less, but the climate change, that this would cause an ecological debt. And this came from Latin America. So one thing from Delhi, the other from Chile, actually. In Chile, there was a group of people calling themselves the Institute of Political Ecology, founded by returned migrants from the Chilean dictatorship, Manuel Baquedano and Sara Larraín, and they produced, at the time, of course, many NGOs were being founded in the 80s and 90s, Instituto de Ecología Política. Even before we started in Barcelona, the journal called Ecología Política. So the institute from Chile was perhaps the first in the world Institute of Ecología Política with that name. And they asked for somebody, Wilfredo Marcelo, to write a pamphlet with somebody else on the ecological debt from the ozone layer and from the climate change. And they wrote it, and I have it at home somewhere. I tend to lose my books because I have a certain resource with my books, but I'm sure it's there still. And Wilfredo Marcelo, La Deuda Ecológica. This was before, again, internet. There was no, well, almost internet was coming, but not for the normal people. You are studying these things in the project Diverse, isn't it? So how things are shown around the world even before the internet. So this was well known at the time, so well known that they went to Rio de Janeiro in '92 with a pamphlet, and many of the people from Latin America at the time, already environmentalists like Acción Ecológica in Ecuador, Censat in Colombia, they were already aware of this ecological debt thing. And then, according to Manuel Baquedano himself, he gave it to Fidel Castro. That's what he told me, and I believe him. one imagine, no? The Latin Americans getting together, what are you going to talk in the 5 minutes you are going to have of a speech, and somebody directly or through somebody else passed the pamphlet to Fidel Castro, who said something that had been said already by Virgilio Barco from Colombia and other people. But when he got up to make his speech, really well known, he said in 5 minutes, but 30 seconds of the meeting was the phrase, to the people, to you, the poor of the world, no? Les damnés de la terre, which are sitting here, do not pay the external debt, do not pay the external debt, claim the ecological debt. And this was perhaps the first time that somebody with a statue that he had at the time in a meeting like this, the meeting of all the heads of government and prime ministers, he said, do pay the ecological debt. So we know already that this has, as you see, 35 years old or more than 35 years old debate could be the debate. But from the north here, the political view of from the northern countries, from the rich countries, the dissimulation of the reality in Rio. Well, Bush, the father Bush, just left and said, we are not going to sign this treaty, isn't it? We are not going to renounce to the standard of living of the US. But the treaty was signed. But the treaty says nothing about the ecological debt. And much, much later, even in Paris in 2015, Todd Stern, who was the representative, a Democrat politician or technician from the US, he said, if the treaty says something of the ecological debt, we leave. We are not going to sign. And all the European countries said exactly the same, the European Union. So this was dissimulated against with the words loss and damage. So finally, after so many years, it was recognized that sea level rise in Bangladesh, for instance, in the mangroves, would cause some loss and damage. No compensation was foreseen, just promises, vague compensations. And this is something which is remarkable, how for so long, instead of increasing the calculations, if you wish, but also the fact of recognizing this ecological debt has been delayed with vague words and vague promises and nothing in reality. Because it's true, if this had been recognized, well, it's like the reparations for slavery, isn't it? Perhaps they're going to go on another 200 years running around the issue and saying, no? I am one of those in favor of taking Columbus' statue in Barcelona out of the column and putting somebody else. No, none of us. I mean, some historical or a symbolic personality, and then Barcelona will be a big debate, and you could debate what we owe to the people of South America for all these nice buildings in Barcelona from the late 19th century, mainly in Cuba, actually. So, but these kind of actions have not taken neither the symbolic actions nor the practical actions of recognizing. But from the South, and I'm finishing, again, there was initiatives. And from so very early on in the debate, in 1994, 95, Oil Watch was founded from Ecuador and from Nigeria, and some other countries joined. I had been in Ecuador for 1 year before, but I had to leave, and I couldn't go to the founding meeting in Lago Agrio. But Nimo Basse from Nigeria was there, and other people from Nigeria. He had been fighting already for 20 or 30 years, perhaps, against the Shell company, which was physically destroying the delta of the Niger, extracting oil. And in 95, a few months after the foundation of Oil Watch, Ken Saro-Wiwa and his companion were killed by hanged or shot by the dictatorship in alliance with the Shell oil company. because they work together normally. All companies, extractivist companies, work with governments, democratic or military. They are totally impartial politically, which kind of governments. And this was, of course, there was some noise about this around the world, but also all what. And from there, Nimo Bassi himself and the people from Acción Ecológica started the slogan, "Leave oil in the soil," to which follow, "Leave coal in the hole," isn't it? And
leave tar in the sand.
What?
Leave tar in the sand. It's a slogan.
And leave grass under the grass. I tried to invent this word, but it doesn't work very well. But keep oil in the soil was not a joke, because this after, in fact, another 20 years, 10 years, in 2007, there was a coincidence of a government in Ecuador with Correa, who was not an ecologist at all, but he had in the government Alberto Acosta, who is a friend of Maristela Svampa, and Gudinas, and all the extractivists, anti-extractivist group, thinkers and activists in Latin America, or in Abya, and they put forward this slogan, not only the slogan, a policy to leave oil in the soil in the Yasuni, and we almost won actually, but we lost at the end because of Correa was against it, and there was also not enough support in some areas of Ecuador, and now it's been a referendum, but it's too late, and they are already extracting the oil. So I think that what we could finish this comment saying that the reason for the optimism is not only that it's been a continuous thinking and writing and activism from the South on all this. It's not that the South has not been acting with the examples. And even more, we see continuously people in the Philippines, like Gloria Capitan, somebody who was killed defending her place near Manila, actually. Marivelis is the place. Against coal stocking and burning, isn't it? Or Fikili Natsangasi in South Africa also a few years ago, fighting against coal mining, and saying the group names of women activists who, I don't know whether they knew the story of Arrhenius in Sweden or not. Doesn't matter anymore, because people like in central India, they are fighting against coal extraction by the Adani company. They don't need to know about the history of climate change. They are realizing climate change already in many places, so they think it will come soon. But also, they get all the cost of this because they are displaced to burn coal, which is going to be burned in coal power plants, like in Philippines. The nickel is being smelted by companies, Chinese companies sometimes, also with coal from Indonesia, perhaps, and so this is the reality. So in the South, there are many, many movements, which we could call leave fossil fuels underground movements, in which they are connecting, as Nimo Bassi in Nigeria did for the first time, I think, in 94, 95, the defense of the local environment, or Fulbari as you have explained here several times, Fulbari in Bangladesh, no? Or Rampal in the Sundarbans, or I don't know, one could also, Karunamoy Sardar, who defended the mangroves in India and they killed her. All these environmental fights from the South, now they are connecting the fight against climate change with the local defense of the environment and life, actually. So that's why, well, your book is so up to date.
Thank you, Joan. So with this, we are starting the conversation part of the event, and I guess first, Farhana, you are going to give a bit of your response to some of Joan's questions and Marianne's point, and then if you start thinking your questions, we'll start collecting them very soon.
Well, thank you so much, Marianne and John, for these lovely comments. It was very educational, I'm sure, for all of us to hear again the importance of the collectives that we have across the world, but at the same time, how we're all thinking together and learning and growing, whilst also sedimenting and not growing and regressing, right? So there's this kind of two steps forward, one step back, but it's the step forward that counts, I believe. So to the point about how, well, the book coheres because it was mapped as a collective project. It underwent like many different iterations and conversations, but it touches on the different points that each of you raised and tries to honor the longer tradition of knowledge from way back, and especially the book from 1992 and then onwards, and to think with, Narayan and Agarwal, and then your work and others, and to think about those connections and how we build our epistemologies over time, but then we also we burrow down, and we figure out that there's all sorts happening away from academia, and academia is just this one spot that often tries to bring things together to make sense, but sometimes we don't make sense. But in many ways, I think it also is a privilege to be able to think together, to have the opportunity to write and to think and theorize and critique and grow. And one of the things that I think is really interesting, and then a point that you raised, Joanne, about so many of these critiques are coming from the Global South, but they're not just critiques, they're theories. They're theories grounded in empirics. So they're actually knowledge production that often gets unheard until it's validated, right, in the Global North. So how do we then reverse that process? Because that process itself is also very imperial, and that's how coloniality is maintained. So I think the fact that John can remember places like Fulbari or Rampal, like these activist movements in Bangladesh, says something not only to your immense recollection, but the fact that we're able to see ourselves and others, we're able to connect the dots. And that is where I believe we can do the work in academia and even as an activist. As you say, we bring what we know from elsewhere, and then we do what we do, and then we take this back and then rework it, right? So I appreciate the points you made, Marianne, about how this resonates with what's happening in Philippines, but also elsewhere in Southeast Asia, but it also resonates with what's happening in Latin America. So I know, Joanne, you had a specific question. I may have missed that. There were like 1, 2, 3. But please remind me if I. Okay. So I'll just. I want to open it up for Q&A, but I'll say one thing. So if we want to have an abolitionist climate praxis with the next, right? So it's theory, action, reflection. So in a very Paulo Freirean way, but also it comes from other traditions and black feminist thought, and also third world feminist thought, whether it's Bell Hooks or Audre Lorde or Chandra Mohanty or Leela Bulukhod and others. So to think about how do we dismantle these systems. So an abolitionist climate praxis, for me, the way I've written about it is careful, which is full of care. So it's care-full, not careful as in cautious. You throw caution to the wind. So it's careful, and that is with care ethics. And that is, I believe, is the revolutionary vehicle that is then able to create more fractures and fissures so that we have more air to breathe, so that others have more clean air to breathe, waters to drink, land to live on, to claim sovereignty, and to reclaim a collective memory, and to have agency. So what do we mean, and how do we get there? And I really firmly believe we do it together, and we do it with care, and deep listening, and humility, and critical reflexivity. So it's a methods question as much as a political question, and an epistemological one. So again, the theory, the triangle I showed is also how we do it in terms of lived experience, and we do it every day, so that we can confront that the imperial violences that continue to impact us all in different ways, whether we recognize it or not. So I'm happy to say a lot more, and I could, but I intentionally kept my introduction very, very short so that we can have a collective conversation. So thank you.
Thank you.
So we gave this event the title Conversation with Farhana Sultana because we really wanted this to be a dialogue. No? It's a unique opportunity to have her here. She doesn't travel to Europe very often. And this possibility of being in the same room and talking to her is something I really appreciate. So I would like to collect now some questions from the audience. Yeah, very good. Okay. Yeah, so there is a microphone coming.
Hi. It was really lovely to hear you all talk. It was very interesting. My question was mainly about the book. I wanted to know what process you went for choosing the countries that are featured in the book. Was it like a holistic view of the global north and the south? Or was it more which places were doing the most interesting research?
Okay, maybe we can take 2 or 3 questions and then we'll respond.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask 2 questions. Basically, one part is on the, if you can expand more on the methodological pluralism that you have talked about. And second part is, I think, your last part on the abolitionist part of the climate coloniality. What I think is also drives this coloniality is the moral imperative given to it, that it is green, that's why it is good. And breaking that moral imperative, I think, is a kind of major problem, and which is more complexifying the whole system, that how do we go about it, because it creates a kind of divergence in the public imaginary also, that these things are good, but why should we talk against all this modern green tech. So I think this on your thoughts, and I think panelists' thoughts also on the confronting the moral imperative that is driving this whole argument. Yeah.
Okay, let's start with this question.
Sure. Thank you. So the first question about how the book came to be and why these particular cases. So the book was much more of an organic project because there were so many interests, so much global interest to have a collective conversation. That's what we started. We started to have a conversation. First it started on social media, then it went on to email, then it was at conferences and workshops. So the way things percolate in academic publishing is who has time to write, right? And also what interesting stories are they telling, and also what survives peer review. So there's all sorts of things going on. So we came together, I organized 8 sessions, each having like 4 or 5 papers. Everyone had to present and sort of go through the vetting process. And it was 8 sessions at the 2023 conference of the American Association of Geographers. And it was hybrid. So you could present from anywhere. So we were online and we were visual and we were in person. And it was many papers that didn't make it in the end, but we had that collective conversation. And then it was like kind of, how do you screen it? Who has actually time to not just present a conference paper, which is short, but to write it, and to write it in a rigorous way, and then to survive both the internal peer review and then also the external. So there's a filtration process. So the conversation still continued. But some of the papers unfortunately couldn't be included because the space limit of the publisher, that no, you cannot have 40 chapters. So you have to have like 25 or less. So there's all these reasons why you see the collection in its present form. And I'm being very frank about the publication process. Not everyone will tell you. They'll just tell you this was the best. They will not tell you the backstory. And there's always a backstory. But these, I believe, are representative of these wider issues about the struggles and the critique and the alternatives. So I try to look at them globally, but then also in terms of being inclusive across different stages of academic career. So there's internal mentorship. So there was a different kind of care built into the project for me and for everyone. And at the end, when we celebrated the book coming out and the book launch, I remember the chapter authors. It's 13 chapters with 20 authors from 5 continents. So they all said that they'd never been a part of a collective like this, that where they felt a sense of kinship, they had a stake in it. It wasn't just, oh, here's another chapter, but this is their book too. And this is why it's so much it's hard work for me as the editor, because, and there's requests coming in, when are you going to do the next one? So it is a collective project, and it goes. And there's different ways it will go in terms of thinking more about the methodology, more about changing policy, more about grounded work, whether it's in loss and damage or green sacrifice or frontier extractivism, and also the moral and imperative in terms of what do we do now, where do we go? Because people want easy, quick answers, and I think that is where we fail. Because when you give easy, quick answers, they solidify and they crystallize, and the world we live in are not tiny little fragments of hard rock, right? It is much more messy, it's much more fleshy, it's much more fluid, it's aqueous, and it's material, and it's gaseous, and it's made of all of us and other species. So when we think about that, so moving into your question about, it was the methodology, methodology in bringing the big book together, or the kind of work I'm focusing on? Right, okay. So the methodological pluralism, I suppose you'll have to read the book, or maybe it's in your library, or you can ask your library to get it. But each chapter tries to articulate its methodology. If it doesn't, it becomes very evident by the time you finish reading it that what they're doing is much more of a intra-theory critique, but it's very grounded in praxis. And others will come out and directly say, we worked at these sites and this is how we did it. And this is the critique, but then also the way we think about alternative imaginations. What are the ways that people can think about this? This is how this one community is doing it. But hey, look, it's also connected to that's happening in Hawaii is somehow linked to what's happening in Hull, UK. There is this kind of there's this kind of not just anti-blackness or anti-indigenous, but there's this continual othering in the production of green or blue new frontiers, right? So, and that links to that new moral imperative that of being green, and this is the right way. So, like for instance, right now, currently, I'm teaching in the United States, but I always say currently because I've lived and worked on 3 continents. I don't know where I'll be, next year. It may be different. At this time, I'm teaching in a top-ranked public policy school in the US, and that was a conscious choice that I made, right? That was a methodological choice. How do I train more policy wonk and technocrats and bureaucrats as fast and as many as possible to make a difference in the world? So that was a conscious, like a pedagogical choice, right? But in terms of ways to think about, confronting the solutions and critiquing it and asking for better solutions, for instance, this electrical vehicular obsession in the United States that I currently see, there's this complete blindness about, well, what's happening to the lithium extraction in the Atacama Desert in Latin America, what's happening to indigenous communities whose waters are poisoned, who are being dispossessed of their land, and then there's indigenous resistance to the poisoning, to the removal, to the sovereignty crisis. So those kinds of issues around rare earth, mineral mining, sand mining, to lithium mining, to all of the things, the materials of the earth that we consume, like the what is it called, the Death Eaters, right? We're just constantly consuming and hyper-consumption. So how do we change that? And that's why I really appreciate the work that's being done in Barcelona and critiquing that, whether it's what you call it post-growth, degrowth, or post-developmental critique, in terms of how do you maintain that radical resistance and impetus, like the Catalan tradition or the Bengali tradition, or in the ways of fighting imperialism that shows up in your methodology, in your pedagogy, in your epistemology, and in your praxis in terms of working with others. And part of that is to think about these green sacrifices and blue sacrifices, because I work also in water, in the way that there's this complete irreverent disregard for the continual othering and dispossession of others because we've now found a solution. But what I do want to just quickly end on is, while we do this critique, we should also be offering, right, alternative ways of being in the world. And that's what we do in each chapter. We do the critique and we show the alternative. We break it down, we reconstitute, and it's a reconstitution that has to come with care and love and joy and a sense of collective action and solidarity. That's the only way we get ourselves out of this capitalist colonial crisis that we're in. So, did you guys want to add to that?
We have a question there, here and there. If there is a third question, we will do it at the same time for the sake of the schedule. Okay. I have a question then afterwards.
Should I ask?
Yes, please.
Perfect. So I want to maybe ask a question that may make no sense to you, but let's see. So I want you to choose between father and mother. So what has the main weight in the climate coloniality project? So does it climate or coloniality? So imagine that you have two policies, and one is most effective on reducing emissions, but is less decolonial, and one that is less effective on reducing emissions, but is more decolonial. What will you choose in that case? What is more important to you or to the project? Thank you.
Marta.
Hello, thank you very much. I wanted to talk about networks and the importance of networks. And I was thinking how your book has maybe through all these collectives you were telling us about, how does this create a network maybe there? We're thinking also with the work that Mariana and many others do here about the EJ Atlas and the importance of using these tools to create networks. And I wanted also to reflect on that, on these international networks, because then you create these networks, but then to sustain them, you have to fly everywhere so the people get to meet face to face versus the we're all online and we don't really get to know each other. So I wanted to, this is something we've been talking to Bea to know how do we, do we want to support, then it's our role in supporting these networks from academia, no? But do we want to carry on supporting these networks that need to be sustained through all these CO2 emissions traveling? Or, yeah, I don't know. It's something that has been confronting me, and I wanted to know what you think.
And I'll use my privilege to make a third question, and with this we think we're going to close because of the time. And yeah, picking up from where Marta has nicely introduced it, so here at Universitat Pompeu Fabra, the good thing we have is a university in which you can easily interact between departments. No? So I see here in the audience people not only from the Department of Political and Social Sciences, that actually they are working on topics of green colonialism, but people from the Department of Humanities that are deeply engaged in understanding agroecological systems in the Global South, and even people from the engineering department that for several years have articulated the research program around the topic of planetary well-being. No? So this is a form of knowledge deeply engaged with societal problems that have interactions, global South interactions, no? And we really want to do a research that is not an extractive research. We are reproducing part of the conversation we just had in the morning. So this is a journey we have to do ourselves. We have to do our own homework. But some type of wisdom would be welcome.
Wow, okay. I also want to give Joan and Marianne an opportunity to respond to these questions if they'd like, or do you want me to start?
Maybe you start.
Okay. All right. So the question there was, is it climate change or coloniality? Well, I don't see them as separate. They're together. There's no separation of the two. But I believe the way I try to explain it in the book, in the original pieces of writing and then also in this collective, is that we cannot understand climate change without colonialism. And even if formal colonialism has ended, coloniality continues in that matrix of power through governance structures, through policies, through institutions, through law, education, but also in terms of the everyday social life, in terms of how different forms of knowledge and peoples and groups are othered or just dispossessed and normalized and sanitized. So it's not one or the other, it's together. But I believe there was a part of your question that asked, like, if there's a good decolonization but bad on climate change, or no? It was like something about a choice, and I didn't quite hear that part correctly. Could you just repeat that?
Yeah, sorry. So I wanted to say that, so you were saying that you want to train policymakers, and policymakers usually have to choose between different policies, and we could imagine that one policy is better for the climate in the terms of emissions, but it may involve certain coloniality in the imposition of this policy, and another one that is less effective on environmental grounds, but it's more just in colonial ways, for example.
Okay, now I understand. So the paradoxes that policymakers often face themselves with, and how to make the best choice out of not very great options, yes? So I think what I'm trying to do is to give policymakers the tools in which to make the best decision in their context, because I don't know what context they're in, which country, which ministry. But once they understand these kind of critiques and the different voices coming from different places, different examples, different ways of understanding the problem, the complexities involved, they're able to make the best choice or reformulate the policy, because the policy doesn't fall from the sky, it's not gravity. It's made by humans. And often they're the ones who are making the policy, or they have the right. If not, they can critique it and reformulate it. So I don't think it's an either or, but for instance, there was one of my students, he was much older, he was a bureaucrat from Nepal. Then he wrote back many years after his course with me that I still remember the stuff we talked about. But even though they get shifted across different ministries, right? He carries with him that form of kind of a methodological critique and that epistemological, and that opportunity to feel like, yes, he understands and he can have voice. He can criticize the minister and explain it and suggest readings, right? So these kinds of ways of, we're like a small peg in the bigger machine. So I did my little part, he's doing his little part, but together we're doing more. Does that make sense? So that's what I mean by like, how do we work with policymakers, is to break down the silo thinking. That's what I try to do. And also sneak in a lot of like feminist and anti-racist and decolonial scholarship, and then they have to read that too to finish the course. And then your question about networks and do no harm, right? How do we do these without causing harm to, this is why I don't fly much. If I have to, it has to be multiple things. So with one flight, I'm doing 10 events, 10 lectures in 2 different countries. But trying to minimize the emissions harm, but at the same time recognizing that for years I've done it before Zoom existed by Skype, because I didn't want to fly and travel. But it was impersonal, so I was this big face on the screen and everybody was down here, and then this camera would move and I would see a small screen of everybody. So you're right, the personal conversation feels different than the impersonal screen one does, but that comes with a cost. And it's also incredibly, so I love the fact that there's a baby in the room. So we can do social reproduction and productive labor simultaneously, but who does that fall on? So there's all these limitations to travel and visa and cost. People from the Global South cannot get visa in development countries. A lot of people at Poland had to drop out the conference last week. They cannot afford it. The visa hassles, the embarrassment they're placed through in the question and answer and the form filling, queuing, waiting in the line, and then the fear, will you be imprisoned at the border control, right? So there's all kinds of colonialities that exist in network building in person. Oh no, baby is leaving. Okay. So we kind of think about these things. How do we build networks? Going to Tobias' question, do I have any solutions? No, I'm thinking with you. So how do we have that deep critical reflexivity and working with others and learning how to do deep thinking, learning how to do deep listening, and learning how to sort of remove ourselves when we need to and silence ourselves, but also practice relational privilege and elevating others. So there's been instances that I know of where professors just said that, okay, I have this money to go here, but I'm sending the student instead. That elevates the student who may not have ever had the opportunity to go to XYZ place, right? So it's a sharing. So it's a form of sharing, but it is incredibly harder and harder as funding is being cut for research and for innovation and for experiential learning and experiential teaching. So we need to therefore create another university. If university and or higher education is the site of where a lot of these networks are able to be funded, that means we need another way to think about these things. Did you guys want to give a very quick response to that?
Hello, I don't know. I just want to build on the networking. My training and my experience as an activist and also campaigner has kind of made me think that networking is a long-term commitment. You know, you build networks. It's not a one-time thing. It's not transactional. And I kind of find it when I entered the university in Belgium, my supervisors always told me that Ph.D. is a very lonely thing that you do things. And it didn't really click on me. It's like, because I grew up in a context and tradition where knowledge is always co-produced in a collective, that your knowledge is never alone. But in academia, which is a very colonial institution, you're kind of, you know, brought up to only be yourself, and kind of bring in the conversation, the knowledge that you learn from the field, etc. That's where the extractivism is. So I kind of see networking within academia that way, that you kind of try to find, you know, map the field, the landscape of who you want to network with and who you want to build relationships with. And there's, I think, indeed a trade-off. I mean, of course, during the pandemic, we were forced to kind of do this. And indeed, actually, our book was born out of the pandemic. We made, you know, it's not the best thing, but, you know, we made do with online and webinars. But there's no replacement and substitution to actual personal communication. And so you have to kind of make those strategic trade-offs. Not to say that you need to fly all the time, because I think that's really bad, but kind of when do you want to come together as a community and actually try to strategize together and think together and think of where you want to change the terrain of the debate, right? I don't know here the landscape in Spain, but in Belgium, there's a strong decolonial movement that's really being pushed, advanced by black scholars and also peoples of color. And that's something that I kind of affiliate my communities. I think the question is, because Farhana said it's the same, I think, for the rest of Europe, funding is really reducing. Can we sustain these networks without funding by, you know, going back to the old school of organizing, of volunteer work, really devoting our time to where we find a kind of put our political energies in without, you know, getting salaries, etc. Because that has been the tradition of activism that I grew up with. It's not the best because, of course, people still need to be compensated. They still need to put, you know, food on the table, etc. But I think that's something to be thought about in academia. Can we sustain this without, you know, having certain projects or getting money and sustaining those relations that we want to maintain, because those networks that we want to build and connect with are actually spaces of radicalism that I think can be a force to reckon with within a very colonial capitalist structure. I don't know if that makes sense in your answer. So.
John gets a lot.
John.
Oh, Dan has a question.
I prefer to listen.
Can we pass yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Dan Brockington from ICTA, and thank you very much for putting this session on. I would like to continue with the networking theme and ask Farhana, given the interest in the subsequent volumes and follow-up volumes, how are you thinking about doing this, and what sort of possibly decentered mechanisms might be involved? And then I'd like to ask Joanne, and I'm sorry, I missed your name. Sorry, Marianne, thank you. I'd like to ask you both if you approve of Farhana's plans or whether you have other suggestions for them.
Wow, okay. I don't have a solidified plan yet. It's just an ongoing conversation, often in jest, because they know it took a lot out of me. It was very intense work. Just to give the quick background, so when the original paper came out in 2022, the month afterwards, my father died and my family faced a lot of crisis. My mom also died. But anyway, so it was just in that time of grieving and care work, elder care work, that I was having to put this book together. And then, you know, and it takes time to then bring the collective, to do the peer review, and then finally it gets published at the very end of 2024 with the 2025 official publication date on the physical book. But the ebook came out at the very end of 2024. So when I think about the next work, the amount of energy and labor that it requires, and in a time of the administration I'm living under in the United States, of more bureaucratic work, the university's falling apart, the absolute job insecurity even for full tenured professors, because there's no idea, no one has any idea about when a university might just implode and fall apart and shut down. I think it requires a certain kind of place from which other scholars, so even in the UK, a lot of universities are imploding. So how do we, in the spaces of ruins, but not of our making, not of our remaking the world, but one of fascist, oligarchical destruction of education, you know, how to create, again, to birth another collection. It might be the time to do it. It might be the right time. I'm not sure. But in terms of the process, I think it would have to be, like, again, another global call, like I did the original one, to see who's interested. And that meant, like, screening through hundreds of abstracts and then getting in touch. And it was a very intense process. And then there are people who were very upset that, wait, I presented when I was, you know, one of the, 40 people who were in those 8 sessions. How come I'm not included? So then going through all of those motions, because there's all kinds of restrictions, right? Because even the written word may not be as good as it was in the spoken 10, 15 minutes. So there is a process. So I'm not sure if that's the best way to do it, but it'll likely have to be virtual, and we have to maybe connect in a digital world or telephonic world if the digital world is too much for certain communities at certain times, because you can't, I don't assume ever that there's electricity or internet or running water, because that's not my experience growing up in Bangladesh. So you take everything you have as a precious gift in that moment in time, that hour, that day, and then you go forth. So we'll see how it goes, but I invite people in this room, if you're interested, to continue the conversation and maybe take on some of the burden sharing, and then we move together, and we'll see how it goes. But there is an interest, because this is a start, right? So then how do we then increase the connections, the rhizomatic networks, underground burrow, in the ground, you know, like, so think of our knowledge and connections and relational kinships over time and place. So we'll see how it goes. So I don't have a perfect, here's the outline, here's the dates, but just a thought, because this was exhausting work, and whether I want to do it well, you know, we have certain kinds of issues happening in the United States right now. But Joan, what do you think about a collection?
Networks, I think, depending on the purpose. For instance, if we think of a network of political ecology, in which in this meeting, in Barcelona, we have done a lot to promote this, isn't it? What you could, well, you've done would be now, you could proclaim yourself the head of the world movement, not world movement, but the world society for political ecology, for instance, in an academic sense. And this, how we do it? Well, we know how to do it. We would have Maristela Svampa here, and somebody from China, certainly, and from India. And the criteria would be what you have published. You would be a member, not just honorary member. You would be the president, and because of your books, and you're known, and how many people are quoting you, and this kind of thing. But this is not this very formal thing. It's how you become a cardinal in the Vatican, for instance. A lot of dirty tricks, and then they know you, and you push other people back, and so on. Then the technicality of how you do, by telegrams, or by internet, or by Holy Ghost is helping you. The other thing would be social movements. And for me, the model for the environmental justice movement, which we don't even know whether it's the right name, perhaps we should call it, certainly not the environmentalists of the poor, because some people object to this, but the environmentalists of the BIPOC, as they say, let's say. I never know, it's BIPOC or BIPOC? BIPOC. Meaning black, indigenous, people of color, and sympathizers, because they are not very bright, not very color. Everybody has some color, but anyway, let's call it the environmentalists of the BIPOC world movement, which I think is growing. How you do it is a question of do it by internet or by this is not the issue. The issue is like in feminism. For me, the example is feminism. You go to Bangladesh, or you go even to Iran, or you go everywhere in the world, and you could ask, I want to meet the feminist movement here. and they will tell, well, they are not here. They are traveling to the United Nations, probably the top ones. But you will find somebody because of the issues. That's the important thing. Social movements are about issues and changing the world. So they would say in Argentina, they are fighting against the anti-abortion laws. In the States now also, nobody was expecting this. In Iran, perhaps some years ago, about the dress, whether they should dress, in which way the people should dress. But this is the feminist environmental movement did not exist like this 100 years ago. There was the suffragettes, some middle-class ladies in England, but now there are books like Lucy Delap, a very good book about the environmental justice movement around the world in 400 pages, which is really difficult to do. So this is how it is. And one could think of the anti-colonial movement. How did Nkrumah connect with other people around Africa? It doesn't matter. The question is that they went out already from the situation. Many of them went to London to study something. And there was a boiling moment in which they could become practical anti-colonialists. And this is the history, I think. The answer is depending on the movement. First you have the movement, and then you have the means of communication.
So the conversation is going to continue because we have some refreshments ready. The time, however, is up for this session. I know that you want to say something, but we are going to continue. I think there would be many opportunities to continue the conversation, not only the conversation, but the more structured articulation of networks. Our colleague Christos Sografos has just left the room, and he organized a very successful first international conference on green colonialism last year that Public Policy Center is foreseeing to organize in 1-2 years, and I think that combined, as you were said, with some virtual encounters, I think will give us another opportunity to meet. In any case, this is just my let's say wishful thinking. I want us to continue the conversation over some coffee and drinks. Thank you very much for being here, for waiting until now, and I can just thank you all, you and you.
Thank you. Would you mind, or if you have objections, then leave the room, but would you mind if we all did one photo together?
Okay.
Oh, where's the camera? There's the
we
cameraman.
have Clara there.
Should we stand?
So
should we sit? What should we do?
Let's start
stand
here.
here.
So come, everyone. Thank you very much.
Can we all form a group? Oh, some people are running away. Yeah, you're going to need to squat because you're too tall.
We have some technicians that need to finish, so the commission is
So
finished.
the photographer can take the photo, right?
Yes.
Yes, we can also get on the stage to move in or squat down or something. You okay, John?
The baby, please.
Oh, the baby's coming.
Thank you, Clara.
Thank you.
Bye.